There are 5 kinds of Crusader Kings 3 gamer. This I know after some 2,600 hours of playing the game, and after considering various mods, the feedback they've received, and the feedback I've received on the mods that I've made. The truth is that while every CK3 player is their own unique person, they can be slotted into a handful of archetypes, which I went over in my unscripted video reflecting on CK3's 2024. Well, I feel I expressed myself pretty well at a basic level there, but I'd like to take the observations from that unhinged rant and put them into a coherent, scripted video, both for your entertainment and to help me wrap my own head around it. Sometimes, the best way to understand something is to force yourself to explain it to someone else, right? This video will answer the following questions for you. What are the 5 CK3 archetypes? Which particular mechanics do they like? How well does each DLC appeal to a particular archetype? And which mechanics have universal appeal, and therefore are the best ones? There's actually one more aspect to cover, and that's the subgroups of archetypes. If you've ever played Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder, this is analogous to a class and a subclass or Pathfinder archetype. The truth is that 5 categories just aren't enough. Subgroups aren't terribly different from their parent archetypes, but their inclusion is important to the understanding of how an interest in a particular playstyle can manifest in different ways. As you watch, think a bit about which archetypes you might fall into, and if you feel you don't fall into any of them, I'd be very interested to hear about what kind of player you are. Rather than bore you with my word-mongering nonsense though, let's instead begin talking about the role player, which is the first of the 5 archetypes I have in mind. You might think that you have an understanding of the roleplay gamer already, and that's because it's a relatively common and understandable way to play the game. The eternal clash between the grand strategy genre and RPG genre is an important piece of CK3's identity, and these role players are not necessarily completely on the RPG side of things, but instead their focus is on the stories that come out of the game. A roleplay gamer is someone that enters the game looking for opportunities to either observe or create stories. Stories do not always correspond to individual characters, but can be as zoomed out as the fate of a continent, or as zoomed in as the illicit, incestuous relationship of a brother and sister. It's only natural that within an archetype there would be further subdivisions, and this to me is the exact subdivision of roleplayers. I mentioned the grand strategy and RPG divide in CK3, and where you fall on that spectrum explains how much towards one subgroup you lean. If your roleplay encompasses world-altering politics and broad cultural changes or new religions that sweep the world, then you're a grand strategy roleplayer. If your roleplay is about family dynamics and the fate of individual characters or their influence on one realm or region, then you're more of an RPG roleplayer. With that said, the mechanics which appeal to a roleplayer of either subgroup are ones which have consequences that are easily abstracted. What that really means is that it's not so much about a particular number or modifier, but instead about what that number means in a story sense. For example, quantifiably, gaining a new kingdom in CK3 gives de jure CBs, increases taxes on de jure vassals in that kingdom, and gives prestige. But abstractly, it's a new order for the region. It's a coronation ceremony and a declaration to the world. A new kingdom is many things for both a particular individual and the wider world around them. Pretty much any mechanic can appeal to a roleplayer since CK3 itself is so abstracted already. With that in mind, roleplayers in general, I would say, like the game in its current state. That might also be because the roleplayers are probably the archetype that Paradox has really tried to appeal to. In terms of mechanics roleplayers don't care for, it's pretty hard to say any particular thing. Instead, it's aspects of a particular mechanic they won't like. For example, a roleplayer might dislike arbitrary game balance limitations, such as not being able to hybridize cultures which share a heritage. Roleplayers yearn for greater options in many cases. I could definitely imagine a roleplayer wishing that interfaith marriage were more possible. Not necessarily easy, but at least doable, right? If you're a roleplay gamer, let me know what sort of stuff you dislike in CK3 because I think it's easy to point to what you do like. Either way, if we boil down the roleplayer mechanics to their concepts, we'll see that, like any story, good roleplay archetype mechanics are a sort of yes-and system. Roleplayers like to have decisions with meaningful outcomes, even if the meaning is mostly an abstraction. The culture system is a mechanic which, while certainly positive for this archetype, would be considered flawed because it sometimes fails the yes-and system. A roleplayer would be the type of person to ask, why do I have to wait 50 years to reform my culture again? I'm not saying they'd want exactly no limitations, but that arbitrary limitations can interfere with their work in creating a compelling narrative. That being said, I think most roleplayers understand the reasoning behind these sorts of limits, given this is, at least in theory, intended to be a balanced strategy game. How real that balance is could be the topic of discussion for a whole other video. Instead though, it leads nicely into the second archetype, which sort of rivals the role players, the balance gamers. It might sound hard to create an entire archetype around balance, but in reality these guys are actually one of the most important and prevalent archetypes in the community. Balance gamers can often find themselves diametrically opposed to roleplay gamers, because the limits that balance gamers want on the game can stifle storytelling. For this reason, their interests are often opposite in DLCs. Consider Roads to Power, which was pretty much universally loved except by the balance gamers, who didn't like how overpowered landless play was. This should also help show you the overwhelming prevalence of every other archetype, as Roads to Power had horrible balance issues, and yet still reviewed on Steam with over 80% positive ratings. If balance gamers were more common, that number would presumably be lower. Regardless, what do we expect to see from a balanced gamer? To me, these are the kinds of people who play multiplayer competitively, or who create challenges for themselves via restrictions in single player. Things like using only knights, or never marrying, and so on. Where the game fails to provide a reasonable challenge with its current balance, balanced gamers will restore that difficulty with other humans in multiplayer, or with arbitrary restrictions on their own play. It's important to note that every player is a tapestry of the archetypes, so it's not like a balanced gamer will always eschew roleplay for game balance, but it's definitely rare to have a person who strongly values both roleplay and balance. In terms of mechanics that balanced gamers like, it runs the gamut, since any mechanic can feel balanced or unbalanced, but I think in particular balanced gamers really like the Conqueror mechanic from the Roads to Power update. Conquerors, although not a replacement for a more intelligent AI, definitely gave something of a threat level to the AI compared to before, although definitely not anything too crazy unless you put on Scourges of God. I think balanced gamers also enjoy when difficult achievements or challenges are added to the game. I'd have said that the Hellenic Roman Empire world conquest was appealing to balanced gamers, but in reality, that challenge was entirely broken and not fun because it just made the game a slog. The constant plagues and tiny little border nations declaring wars wasn't fun at all for anyone, and the fact that it was bugged so that completing the world conquest didn't actually fix anything was just the cherry on top. Ultimately, bad mechanics are bad mechanics, no matter who they appeal to. In terms of DLCs that balanced gamers like, I don't have as much of a finger on the pulse of that particular community, but I'd wager that they have been feeling pretty displeased with CK3 lately. Probably around Royal Court and Fate of Iberia would be the era of CK3 that balanced gamers liked the most, just because Royal Court introduced some new complications to the game in the form of cultures and courts, and Fate of Iberia added some difficult accomplishments with the struggle. It was in tours and tournaments that we saw the game's economy kind of go insane because of how taxation tours entirely upset the meta of the game. Feel free to correct me if you consider yourself a balanced gamer, by the way. Boiling down the mechanics that balanced gamers like, I'd say it comes down to reasonable rewards for reasonable accomplishments and a genuine feeling that the game is trying to get in the way of your success, whatever success might mean to you. I want to be clear that similarly to roleplay gamers, it's not always just about numbers. For example, a complaint from CK2 to CK3 that many people have, let alone balanced gamers, is how easy it is to change religions. You can just convert to Hellenism with a simple click in CK3 after you stack some conversion modifiers anyway, while in CK2, it was a whole ordeal unless you played in Laconia in 769, but you know, if you know, you know. Hence, we have the subgroups of balanced gamers, the active challenge seekers, the multiplayer gamers, and the reasonable gamers. Challenge seekers are your arbitrary limitation types who want to see the game become more difficult by locking off particular mechanics. This forces some creativity, and these players get satisfaction out of defeating the dragon they've made for themselves. Multiplayer gamers are pretty self-explanatory, but tend to be the kind of players that want to play toe-to-toe with other players that can actually challenge them. They might also use arbitrary restrictions to limit overpowered stuff, like murder plots. The reasonable gamers are the sort of people that care about the rewards of particular decisions or events. Think of a challenge seeker, but more focused on the minutiae than the overall difficulty of the game. A reasonable gamer will look at money gained from making a killing and say it should be reduced, while a challenge seeker would just say I'm not allowed to use making a killing. You see the difference? It's obviously pretty minute, but it makes a difference between a dissatisfied player and a satisfied one, and all three subgroups are trying to answer the same problem. Your most vocal complainers in CK3 are probably going to be the reasonable gamer subgroup of the balanced gamers, simply because they want the game to be more balanced, and lately, CK3 has been anything but. To be totally honest, I can't think of an era where CK3 was genuinely well balanced. It's always kind of been a game with different priorities. Nonetheless, at least part of the community cares about this a lot. I think it's also important to note that there do exist CK3 players that aren't like masters of the game, which is often the cohort that I have in mind when thinking about the game. Some players actually do feel that CK3 is too hard, although I just call it a skill issue personally. There do exist players who want the game to be made easier, but it's important to note that those players will, once they actually become good at the game, graduate into more of your traditional balanced gamer. The only question is if they'll stick around long enough to get there. What keeps a lot of players going in the game can often be their interest in the history represented in-game, and for that reason, a pretty big and important archetype is the history gamer. Obviously, Crusader Kings 3 is an inherently ahistorical game, if only because the multifaceted nature of history makes it inherently impossible to simulate completely accurately. Nonetheless, there's an agreement every gamer makes with the games they play. They agree to, at least some extent, suspend their disbelief and play according to the game's rules. For example, CK3 doesn't really simulate things like crop failures or migration during war. In real life, wartime would often see a scattering of a population such that one might see enclaves of foreign peoples in cities. In fact, minority cultures just aren't represented at all in CK3, but that's okay for most people, because it's not one of the facets of history that CK3 claims to simulate for you. CK3 isn't Victoria 3, which does simulate those things, so that begs the question of what history CK3 does simulate. This is the crux of concern for a history gamer archetype. It's not about everything lining up with real history properly, but that the alternate histories provided by the game can reasonably be derived from real history. For example, it would be unreasonable, to many history gamers, to simulate a lot of the supernatural content that was in CK2. Satanic cults actually being able to regrow limbs, like in CK2, would definitely be critiqued by history gamers as ruining their immersion, depending of course on how strict that particular person is. The range of complaints and concerns from history gamers is huge, since there's always something inaccurate in the game. One really strong example is the tendency for the Norman kings of England to embrace English culture, when in reality such a thing didn't really happen until only maybe the very latest era of the game. The 1178 start date helped with this a bit by giving us a time in-game where there are actual Normans in power over an English culture realm. But establishing English culture as, say, William the Conqueror in 1066, we'll see William speaking Anglic. That to me is an entirely reasonable complaint. Historicity is the name of the game for history gamers, and that historicity doesn't have to come from actual historical occurrences, but instead just needs to be somewhat justifiable. For example, the reclamation of the British Isles by Brythonic or Gaelic cultures is based on the historical animosity between the invading Anglo-Saxons and Normans and the native Celtic peoples in Britain. This decision makes total sense in that context, even if historically the Celtic peoples mostly were assimilated into their conquering cultures and never did reconquer the British Isles. With that in mind, we jump to the quite easily identifiable subgroups of history gamers, which are the alternate history and faithful history gamers. Your alternate history gamers enjoy some wacky but plausible ideas, while faithful history gamers focus more on bringing actual historical content to the game. Examples of alternate history content are everywhere in CK3. Check out the revival of Rome, or Bactria. Check out some of the really obscure heresies and Gnostic faiths, which reasonably should be quite dead in-game, but which can be revived. Check out pagan faith reformations, and so on. Meanwhile, actual historical content is a little sparser. Things like William the Conqueror's invasion of England are actual faithful historical events. Systems like the Byzantine administrative government try to represent the history of that particular empire better, and stuff like the Iberian struggle or Iranian intermezzo tie into the history there too, to lesser or greater success depending on who you ask. Even small things like what culture traditions each culture starts the game with can be considered forms of faithful historical representation. For some people, issues like bringing a unique government system to the Holy Roman Empire are really important, and for others, it matters more what the Holy Roman Empire can do. Alternate history gamers are all about new decisions and unique outcomes. They're all about making cool but reasonable hybrid cultures or tracing their actions in-game to a reasonable historical route. In that sense, many historical gamers also lean into roleplay gaming, given how history is essentially a set of stories. Meanwhile, your more faithful historical subgroup focuses on the game start. I think characters like Hereward and El Cid being given more railroaded history content really appealed to these faithful history gamers, even if some alternate history is sprinkled in. It's not that the super faithful historical reenactment type gamers care strongly that the game follow history, just that it at least begin in history and try to simulate some of the most important historical events. I think a real triumph of this idea was the addition of the Fourth Crusade. It's an actual historical event which dynamically can occur in-game. I don't know the thoughts and feelings of all the historical gamers, but I'd bet that they appreciated this level of historicity and dynamism. History gamers make up a pretty large cohort of the CK3 player base, I think, if only because, like roleplay gamers, Paradox tries to cater to them when possible. History gamers and roleplay gamers pretty much fit hand in hand because of their tendency to care about stories. The difference is that a roleplay gamer might be completely fine with playing an Indian ruler in Ireland that follows an African pagan faith with a name like Steve, so long as the way that happened was interesting, while a history gamer would have their immersion completely ruined by that, unless you concocted some immense historical justification for it. Likewise, a role player might feel restricted by the game when certain interactions demand a certain culture or faith, even if that action would only make sense for that culture or faith historically. Generally speaking, I think history gamers like the idea of flavor packs, but it depends heavily on how well the flavor pack actually corresponds to the history. I think it would be quite hard to create a satisfying flavor pack because history is complicated, and so representing it properly would require a lot of work. But flavor packs are generally pretty small pieces of content. You end up with something that often comes up short history-wise, but that, if it focuses too much on history, will end up having poorly designed mechanics. This, I believe, is why every flavor pack to this day has had a mixed review on Steam. That being said, the best reviewing flavor pack is Northern Lords, and that DLC was able to provide some very compelling mechanics alongside some historical flavor, so it goes to show that a flavor pack absolutely can work. Where I think history gamers thrive more is in the Steam Workshop, with mods like Rice and Viet. I haven't played these mods extensively, so I can't speak to their quality personally, but I know they're very popular, and that would likely be because of how they appeal to the history gaming cohort. That leads me well into the kinds of people who couldn't care less for history, or roleplay, or even balance. The ultimate GIGACHAD player, the hyper gamer. Although I'd say CK3 is somewhat poorly suited to it, some people use it as their power-tripping hyper game. This is not to be confused with the balanced gamers who want adversity. No, a hyper gamer just wants to be as overpowered as possible and do crazy stuff. They're mechanical monsters, and they see any given decision or event for its numbers. They're the kinds of people who don't care about whether or not something is reasonable or justified or anything really. They'll make a hybrid culture of a Norse and Indian culture to get Varangian veterans and elephants, even if it would be nonsensical in-game. They'll hold 10 duchies to build all the duchy buildings, even if it means spreading their domain around their entire empire unreasonably. Ultimately, a hyper gamer just loves to see the big numbers go up. Nothing wrong with that. I think hyper gamers really love big decisions that give huge rewards, and so, unironically might enjoy struggles only for the possibility to end them. They also really appreciate modifier stacking culture traditions. The hyper gamers loved only the strong, because it let them stack up even more power in their men-at-arms, and to me, it makes total sense. I've always found CK3 to be a game which is best played with a sense of roleplay, but in truth, if you just want to do crazy stuff, CK3 can be quite well suited to it sometimes. I still wager that EU4 is better suited to power gaming, but I digress. I think hyper gamers are your ultimate endgame enjoyers who are looking for powerful stuff to work towards in the game. If a new decision comes out, and is relatively inconsequential just mechanically, you'd probably see hyper gamers scoff at it. Consider the Danelaw decision, which sees England and the Danelaw partition themselves. I think that's a super cool mechanic, even if a bit bare bones, but if I were a hyper gamer, I'd ask why it even exists. It does nothing really, beyond create some cool dynamic history and represent a real historical event to some extent. In a way, hyper gamers have the inverse concerns of balanced gamers. They fear the game becoming too flat and losing the appeal of modifier stacking. Luckily for the hyper gamers, CK3 has kind of always been pretty unbalanced, and it's been quite possible to achieve insane things in almost every iteration of the game. That remains true today with the relatively poorly balanced roads to power. An important distinguishing factor for hyper gamers is that they don't really pursue achievements. I'm sure that some do, of course, but I mean broadly, they're more interested in creatively achieving whatever they have in mind, and what they have in mind will be just absolute dominance of the game. While I've mentioned modifier stacking as one thing, it's more than that. World conquerors are hyper gamers, of course, and so are people that try to get 99 in a stat, or try to get every dynasty legacy, you name it. These things are impressive, but not necessarily just in terms of numbers. The way that a person has to play in order to even access all the DLC dynasty legacies is in itself impressive. You'll have to also earn a ton of renown, and the path to that would be something a hyper gamer would love. Not all hyper gamers are necessarily successful ones. An aspiring hyper gamer will strive for something and maybe fail or spend significant time trying to reach it. Sometimes hyper gamers who are relatively new to the game will be happy just to farm any empire, let alone something insane. Insanity is a relative term like that, I guess. Anyway, the kinds of mechanics that appeal most strongly to hyper gamers are the mechanics which have the highest possible ceiling of power. It's not necessarily about just easily obtaining power, as that can be boring, but instead the idea that you can, through the right exploits or stacking or playstyle, obtain immense power. There are generally, to me, three kinds of hypergamers: the core gamer, the exploiter, and the debugger. These are essentially just amplified versions of the general hypergamer. A core gamer generally avoids what they might consider to be exploits or cheats, instead putting value on the legitimate acquisition of power. An exploiter will use exploits to do huge things, such as stacking big renown through the Secure the Mediterranean decision back when it was broken, but they won't do something as blatant as launch the game in debug mode and just make stuff happen. That would be the territory of the debugger, who I want to be clear, is listed without judgment. If a person enjoys just creating huge numbers and wants to skip the malarkey to get it done, that's fine. What lines a hypergamer is willing to cross, in essence, determines their subtype. We're coming up on the last CK3 archetype, and it's a bit of an anticlimactic ending, in that it's the kind of player you likely have never even thought about as an archetype. It's the achievement hunter gamer. Quite obviously, achievement hunters look for achievements, and that's about all they care about. I stress again, as I have a few times now already, that people are all a tapestry of archetypes, but I will also say that there is a cohort of gamers in CK3 that just go for achievements, and once they get them, they just close the game. It's crazy to me, but I get it in a way. For achievement hunters, all that really matters is whether the new update or DLC or whatever has interesting achievements, and they will, if they're pure achievement hunters, do whatever they can to get the achievements. That might include exploits, it might include looking up guides, or it might include just playing the game and trying over and over just for the right RNG to ease the process. There aren't really any particular mechanics or concepts or design choices that achievement hunters look to. They just look at achievements. And I'd say a pretty solid set of achievements came with Royal Court and Tours and Tournaments. Those two DLCs really brought some heavy hitters to the game like Lingua Franca, Ahab, and Little William Marshall. As an achievement speedrunner myself, I do understand the value of some well-made and creative achievements, as when an achievement is fun to do, it makes the game significantly more enjoyable. In my CK3 career, I've since pivoted more towards my own goals, and as such don't pursue achievements as much as I used to, but I still go and grab the ones that interest me most of the time. I also promised my community more all-achievement guides, but as a now 24-year-old boomer, I'm having trouble finding both the time and will to pull off another 30+ hour speedrun. One day, guys. One day. Back to the topic at hand, I don't have nearly as much to say about this archetype of CK3 player because they're just so much more self-explanatory. The two subgroups of Achievement Hunter are basically just those who cling to Iron Man and those who have accepted the no Iron Man way. I think many Achievement Hunter gamers feel that this change in CK3 away from needing Iron Man to get achievements was a huge loss to the value of achievements. It's hard to argue with them in that sense too. Iron Man apostles will either choose to play in Iron Man despite the ability to get achievements without them, or they'll complain on the forums talking about how the game sucks now that Iron Man is meaningless. Meanwhile, the non-Iron Man enjoyers might be ambivalent towards the issue, or just play without Iron Man and enjoy their time anyway. It's an entirely valid way to play, and it's also valid to be upset over Iron Man's diminished importance. The best DLCs for Achievement Hunter Gamer will naturally be those which provide the best achievements, and those which make older achievements more interesting to get. For example, Roads to Power, although it came with, in my opinion, relatively mid achievements, has made achieving lots of other achievements way more interesting. Consider the Fate of Iberia Legacy of the Campeadors achievement, and how it has been changed by the ability to just play El Cid and pair it with Mio Cid. Definitely a big positive. I think a lot of achievement hunters love to stack up achievements, although maybe those who do and those who don't could be their own archetypes. Anyway, I've now spent what I will estimate while writing this to be about 20 minutes of your time just explaining some archetypes. What's the point of all this? Well, I don't know, man. Is the pursuit of knowledge not worthwhile for the mere accumulation of it in and of itself? Yeah, okay, so it's not. How can we use this information? I think the Crusader Kings 3 community has quickly become radical, to use the Victoria 3 term. Paradox gamers have always been high-standard type folks, if only because so much of their lives and dollars go into the game, but lately it feels like there's a lot of vitriol between community members. It can feel like some people get a lot of hate for their preference with the game, and I'm not innocent in this. Sometimes I feel some anger towards the history gamers because I don't think flavor is a good replacement for good mechanics, which speaks more to my inner hyper gamer and roleplay gamer. For example, I found that Fate of Iberia didn't really add much to the game. It's not that it added nothing, this isn't a binary of course. Fate of Iberia was okay to me, but it could have been a lot more if it focused on adding some actual new mechanics. It instead focused on trying to simulate the push and pull of relations between the Taifas and Christian kingdoms. That history is cool, but I'd have liked something more than joining wars via contracts with pop-ups that come up on the screen and don't pause the game. Sorry, that's a very particular speedrunning complaint and isn't relevant to like 95% of players. That aside, The point is that your fellow CK3 gamers are different players that have their own interests. It's all about tolerating the people in your community, is what I'd say if I weren't based. The real truth, guys, the unbridled, legitimate truth, is that no matter your archetype, some mechanics just suck. And this is where I take where you thought this was going and I send it down the drain. While archetypes may inform preferences, they do not inform quality. One thing I've learned about CK3 is that when a mechanic is bad, it's not taken well, even by players that might have a preference for that mechanic. I love pointing the finger at Legends. Oh, Legends, the ultimate adversary, the devil of CK3. No one likes Legends except OPB. He's the one guy that likes them. He's all the 32% positive reviews on Legends of the Dead. Okay, anyway, let me just pull this back to a less toxic place because there is a real point here. I'm not just making a callback to the legendary 9 out of 10, pun intended, nor am I trying to fan the flames of CK3's sometimes toxic community. I instead want to send a message to the armchair game designers and forum posters that think they know what they want in the game. I love tautological statements because they're things I love. A bad mechanic in a video game is bad. Anytime you have any idea for the game, consider something first. What would this look like as a game mechanic? And once you have that in mind, consider as well, who is this mechanic for? Take a mechanic as simple as arranging a marriage. At a glance, arranging a marriage is a way to produce heirs, period. But it's a lot more than that. It influences your stats, it creates claims, it creates alliances, it ultimately appeals to every kind of gamer for such obvious reasons that you probably don't think about it. For that reason, you'll never see someone complain about the marriage mechanic. It serves its purpose, it appeals to every archetype, and it isn't buggy. That being said, you'll still get people who will sometimes want greater mechanical power from marriages, and that's fine. For example, I've heard role players sometimes talk about wishing that a rebellious kid could refuse an arranged marriage and run off when threatened with a marriage. Sounds pretty cool if you ask me. To be clear, any given mechanic, even if it's good, isn't necessarily perfect, like marriages. No mechanic is really perfect. It's just a matter of at what point something becomes bloat and how well a mechanic maintains the balance of its archetypal approval. Although the role players would love a system of rebellious daughters refusing arranged marriage or something, I can see other players being frustrated by their kids constantly getting uppity. Maybe you tie it into traits, so that the historical gamers can have justification to raise their children to be more humble, as a more placid daughter won't rebel against your marriage. But what about the hyper gamers? You'll have to give them some kind of reward for arranging the appropriate marriage such that their kids don't rebel. Let's say that your kids can get bonus stats for being in happy marriages, whereas abusive marriages can cause health negatives. Okay, nice. Make sure to balance the change such that any given kid will rebel wisely, and tie it into predictable metrics like traits and prestige and stuff, so the balanced gamers don't get too upset. Finally, you can sprinkle in an achievement or something for having 10 kids and having them get into marriages that they agree to appease the achievement hunters. And now, I'd wager you have a pretty good addition to the marriage mechanic. I will quickly add that for the purpose of mod making achievements isn't usually very viable, so I totally get it if that step is skipped, and of all the steps to skip, that's the one you should skip. I would not be surprised if I missed some important aspects of creating mechanics here, by the way. This is just an example for the purpose of demonstration, to get you an idea of what things to consider when you put forward ideas for mechanical systems. Hey, maybe I should go make this marriage refusal mechanic as a mod. Could be interesting to test out my own theory. We'll see if I get around to it. It is, in my opinion, vital that when you consider the quality or value of any mechanic, you think about things in a certain order. Firstly, is the mechanic actually good in concept? Most of the time, if an idea sounds good, it probably is good, but it might be valuable to ask for some other opinions anyway. Once you've got that in mind, it's time to mold that idea into an actual game mechanic in the form of an intended outcome and numbers and motivations to use the mechanic and so on. Finally, you fine-tune it to the CK3 archetypes that you want to appeal to. While I think a good mechanic just needs to be good for one archetype, a great mechanic needs to be good to every archetype. Grand tournaments and tours are examples of mechanics which are good for every archetype. Roleplayers get a story out of the competition or tour. Balanced gamers exchange their gold for prestige and artifacts, or on tour, they exchange it for more gold if it's a taxation tour. History gamers get to simulate much of the actual medieval games and the idea of a king visiting the palaces of his vassals. Hyper gamers can use these mechanics as part of their builds to stack modifiers from rare events or gain experience in traits like Hastelooter, which itself is fun for them. Finally, achievement hunters get some nice achievements associated with the activities. Compare that to a much worse mechanic like Legends. The roleplay is weak because Legends don't create a story, they just happen in the background. They're unbalanced because their cost is too high, although I will add that the game rule to decrease their cost helps this. Nonetheless, the rewards for a legend are not worth the opportunity cost of the gold and what it could have been used for otherwise. Historically, legends don't feel like they do a good job of simulating the medieval legends of old simply because the nature of the legend has no bearing on the consequences of the legend. But hypergamers actually might be somewhat happy with these, since legendary buildings are pretty good. I'll give that one a checkmark actually. Finally, the achievements related to legends are pretty bad. Nothing of any particular interest in there. Sorry to keep going on and on, I just wanted to put some effort into citing actual things in-game to explain my stances. Sometimes it's really easy to just put opinions forward, but I want to be better than that. The best mechanics in CK3 always appeal to all the archetypes, and the worst ones appeal to few or none of them, or are just bad mechanics from their inception. To be very fair to Paradox, by the way, I don't think any of their mechanics are just bad from inception. I think Paradox pretty much always throws good ideas at their community. I've never read a dev diary and been like, nah, that sounds like a bad idea. Like I've been trying to say pretty often these days, a good idea is not always a good mechanic unless it's done right. Anyway, that's why the archetypes matter. They inform the differing reasons for why people prefer one mechanic over another, and they also inform the benchmarks by which a mechanic can be rated. Ultimately, it's really not that important, and this is something which I care about only insofar as the armchair game designer in me likes to come to a greater understanding of the game. I like talking about the game, and I think especially I've gotten to thinking about this stuff as I've gotten more and more into modding. I'd be really curious, by the way, if anyone here feels there are different archetypes of players out there, simply because I genuinely think these 5 types really do correspond to just about any possible type of player, but there may be playstyles I've just never heard of or engaged with. It would be super cool to learn more about new ways people play the game. I'd considered an archetype for the aesthetic gamer, in the sense of players that just design coats of arms and dress up their characters or make DNA for people and admire their creations, but I just felt like that they all could fall into the roleplay gamer or something. It was a tough choice to cut, but it felt like it only covered a tiny portion of the community. Regardless, let's call it 5.5 archetypes maybe. I hope you're leaving this video with some new perspectives and a satisfying acquisition of new knowledge. Thank you for your time.